The drone hovered like a mechanical vulture, its camera lens glinting in the early morning sunlight. Melissa Hartwell gripped her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white, watching the unmistakable silhouette of a DJI Mavic cutting precise patterns across her 5-acre farm's perimeter. This wasn't just any drone. This was Karen Thompson's latest weapon in her ongoing crusade against what she considered rural neighborhood impropriety. The machine made another tight pass over the chicken coop, then swept across the vegetable gardens where heirloom tomatoes and heritage corn grew in meticulously maintained rows. Melissa knew exactly who was controlling it, and why. 3 months ago, the Ridgemont Estates Homeowners Association had declared war on her property. What started as a minor dispute over fence height had escalated into a bureaucratic nightmare that would make most people crumble. But Melissa Hartwell wasn't most people. She was a former cybersecurity engineer who traded Silicon Valley stress for sustainable farming, and she developed a reputation for being quietly, ruthlessly intelligent. The HOA board, led by Karen Thompson, had no idea what they were walking into. The drone banked sharply, its propellers humming with mechanical precision. Melissa didn't move. She'd been expecting this, preparing for this moment with the same calculated patience she used when breeding her rare heritage chicken varieties. Karen Thompson represented everything Melissa had left behind in corporate America: petty power dynamics, obsessive rule following, and a complete inability to see the human element behind regulations. At 52, Karen had transformed herself into the ultimate HOA enforcer, her silver bob and pressed cactus a uniform of suburban authority. Melissa took a slow sip of her coffee, her mind already mapping out potential countermeasures. The drone wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was a declaration of war. The Ridgemont Estates HOA bylaws were a labyrinth of regulations so complex they seemed designed to trap residents in perpetual violation. Fence height, regulated. Grass length, measured monthly. Chicken coops, restricted to precisely 0 square feet within the development's boundaries. But Melissa's property sat on a peculiar boundary, technically part of the HOA's jurisdiction, yet legally independent due to an archaic land covenant predating the neighborhood's development. Karen had been trying to force her into compliance for months, and this drone surveillance was her latest tactic. What Karen didn't know was that Melissa had spent the last decade building an arsenal of technical skills far more sophisticated than amateur drone reconnaissance. Her fingers, which had once configured military-grade network security systems, now itched with possibility. The drone made another pass, lower this time, close enough that Melissa could hear the individual whir of its stabilization motors, close enough to see the camera's precise angle of descent. Close enough. A faint smile crossed Melissa's lips. She set down her coffee mug and walked toward her workshop, each step deliberate. The game was about to change, and Karen Thompson had no idea what was coming. Behind her, the chicken flock clucked softly, seemingly oblivious to the technological drama unfolding across their domain. But Melissa knew better. In rural territories, nothing happened without intention, and she was nothing if not intentional. The Ridgemont Estates Community Center buzzed with its typical Wednesday evening energy, a mix of passive-aggressive whispers and performative civic engagement. Karen Thompson sat front and center, her meticulously organized 3-ring binder open to a section labeled Non-Compliant Properties, her red ballpoint pen poised like a weapon. Item 7, she announced, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. The Hartwell property continued violations. Bill Rodriguez, the HOA board's most reluctant member, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd known Melissa for years and understood something the others didn't. This wasn't going to be a simple takedown. Karen's finger traced a detailed map annotated with multiple sticky notes: red for fence violations, yellow for landscaping concerns, blue for what she termed agricultural zoning discrepancies. To Karen, Melissa's farm wasn't just a property, it was a personal affront to suburban order. Drone surveillance has provided conclusive evidence, Karen continued, clicking a remote that projected images onto the community center's aging screen. Aerial shots of Melissa's property filled the wall: chicken coops, vegetable gardens, an old barn that looked like it had stories etched into its weathered boards. What Karen didn't know was that each of those images was exactly what Melissa had wanted her to see. 2 days earlier, Melissa had prepared an elaborate technological trap. Her workshop, a marvel of custom-built equipment and repurposed cybersecurity hardware, had been humming with potential. She understood something fundamental about technology that Karen could never grasp: every system has vulnerabilities. The drone currently circling her property wasn't just being watched. It was being studied, mapped, and most importantly, prepared for. Bill leaned over and whispered to Karen, "Are we sure about this approach? Melissa is not exactly someone who backs down easily." Karen's laugh was sharp, practiced. "She'll comply. Everyone complies eventually." But compliance wasn't in Melissa Hartwell's vocabulary. Not anymore. In her previous life, she'd been a lead security architect for a major tech firm. She designed systems that could detect and neutralize threats before they even register as blips on conventional monitoring equipment. Leaving corporate America hadn't diminished those skills, it had refined them. The drone program Karen was using was off-the-shelf consumer technology. To Melissa, it might as well have been a child's toy. Back on the farm, her custom-built signal interference device was already calibrating. It looked like nothing more than an old router modified with additional antennae, sitting innocuously near her barn. But its capabilities were anything but ordinary. As Karen continued her presentation, detailing alleged violations with bureaucratic glee, Melissa was preparing her response. Not with angry emails or legal threats, but with a demonstration that would make the entire HOA rethink their approach. The community center's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, a subtle hint of the technological storm brewing just beyond the subdivision's manicured borders. Bill Rodriguez watched Karen with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. He'd seen neighborhood disputes before, but something about this one felt different. Melissa Hartwell wasn't just defending her property. She was about to make a statement. And statements in rural territories had a way of echoing far beyond their initial impact. The signal interference device hummed to life precisely at 6:17 a.m., just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the Ridgement Estate's horizon. Melissa watched from her kitchen window, her hand wrapped around a steaming mug of locally roasted coffee, as Karen's drone began its predictable morning patrol. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The drone maintained its typical grid-like pattern, sweeping methodically across her property. But then, a subtle wobble, almost imperceptible. Another pass. This time, a more pronounced drift. Melissa allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Her custom-built electromagnetic disruption system was working perfectly. The drone's GPS began to flutter. Its stabilization protocols, so meticulously programmed, started to fail. What had been a precision instrument now moved like a drunk honeybee, zigzagging unpredictably across the morning sky. 300 yards away in a perfectly maintained colonial-style home, Karen Thompson sat at her desk, fingers flying across her keyboard. She was drafting yet another formal complaint, a 17-page document detailing every perceived infraction on Melissa's property. Her monitors showed the drone's feed, and something was wrong. Static. Interference. The crisp aerial view dissolved into a wash of electronic noise. "What the?" Karen muttered, her fingers freezing mid-keystroke. On Melissa's farm, the drone began its final dance, a spectacular, uncontrolled descent that would have been beautiful if it weren't so precise in its chaos. It spiraled, losing altitude with mechanical resignation before landing with a soft thud in a patch of carefully cultivated wildflowers. Dead. Neutralized. Bill Rodriguez pulled into the HOA parking lot precisely at 7:45 a.m., his weathered pickup truck a stark contrast to the rows of meticulously waxed SUVs. He'd been on the HOA board for 15 years, long enough to know when something interesting was brewing. Karen burst through the community center doors at 8:03, clutching a folder and looking like a thundercloud and taking human form. "We've been hacked," she declared to no one in particular. Bill raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too, Karen." Her hand slammed the folder onto the reception desk. "The drone, it's been compromised. Completely neutralized." "Sounds like a technical problem," Bill replied, his voice maddeningly calm. "Maybe you should call the manufacturer." What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that this was more than a technical problem. This was a calculated response, a warning. Melissa had worked in cybersecurity long enough to know that the best defense was always a demonstration of capability. The drone wasn't just disabled. It was a message. Back on the farm, her heritage chickens pecked contentedly around the fallen drone, nature reclaiming its territory with casual indifference. A single hawk circled overhead, nature's own surveillance system watching the technological wreckage. The war had officially begun. In her workshop, surrounded by screens and custom-built equipment that looked more like art than technology, Melissa reviewed the drone's telemetry data. Every movement, every signal, every attempted correction. Perfect. The HOA thought they were fighting a simple property dispute. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had turned their own technology against them. Slowly, methodically, with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a predator. The legal notice arrived exactly 7 days after the drone incident, delivered by a courier with the precision of a military operation. Melissa found the envelope tucked between her mailbox and a post adorned with climbing honeysuckle, its crisp white surface a stark contrast to the weathered rural landscape. Karen Thompson's letterhead was unmistakable, embossed with the Ridgement Estate's Homeowners Association logo, a design that screams suburban conformity. Melissa didn't need to read beyond the first paragraph to understand the game being played. Violation notice. Failure to comply. Mandatory hearing. Her fingers traced the embossed seal, feeling the weight of bureaucratic aggression. This wasn't just a warning. This was an escalation. In the barn, her custom server rack hummed softly. Rows of monitors displayed data streams, HOA email archives, property records, zoning documents. Melissa had spent weeks building a digital fortress, collecting every piece of information that might prove useful. The property covenant that protected her land was a legal marvel, a remnant from the 1950s when this area was still considered rural farmland. Most modern HOA boards didn't even know it existed, but Melissa had found it, digitized it, and was prepared to use it. At the community center, Karen assembled her arsenal. Printed photographs of alleged violations, drone surveillance stills, a meticulously organized binder that read like a prosecution brief against Melissa's farm. Bill Rodriguez watched her preparations with growing unease. He'd seen Karen's crusades before, but this felt different, more personal. "You're going nuclear over a few chickens and an unconventional fence," he muttered, shuffling some papers. Karen's response was immediate. "This isn't about chickens. This is about maintaining community standards." The hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m., prime time for HOA drama. Melissa knew the routine. These meetings were less about resolution and more about public performance. Neighborhood politics distilled into its most performative essence. She spent Wednesday preparing, not with legal documents or defensive strategies, but with something far more precise. Her workshop became a command center. Servers cross-referenced documents. Algorithm-driven research pulled obscure zoning regulations. Each piece of information was cataloged, analyzed, prepared. The Heritage Breed Preservation Act, agricultural zoning exemptions, historical land use covenants. Melissa wasn't just preparing a defense. She was building a strategic offensive. The night before the hearing, she walked her property. Heritage chickens, rare breeds that were more than just livestock, but living historical artifacts, packed quietly. Her vegetable gardens, meticulously maintained, represented more than just food. They were a statement of independence. Karen saw a violation of suburban aesthetics. Melissa saw a connection to land, to history, to something deeper than manicured lawns and identical houses. As moonlight cast long shadows across her farm, Melissa reviewed her preparations. The drone incident was just the opening move. The hearing would be the real battle. And battles, in her experience, were won long before the first shot was fired. The community center's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare across rows of folding chairs filled with Ridgemont Estate's most invested residents. Melissa arrived exactly 15 minutes early, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder, a meticulously organized portfolio tucked under her arm. Karen sat at the head table, her silver bob perfectly styled, a red pen poised like a weapon of bureaucratic destruction. The room crackled with a tension that went far beyond a simple property dispute. "Item 7, Karen announced, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "Non-compliant property assessment, Hartwell Farm." Bill Rodriguez, seated to Karen's right, looked like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He'd seen neighborhood disputes before, but something about this one felt different. Melissa wasn't just defending her property, she was challenging an entire system. The first slide appeared on the projection screen. Drone footage of Melissa's farm, annotated with red circles highlighting alleged violations. Fence height, livestock placement, landscaping irregularities. What Karen didn't know was that every single piece of evidence she prepared was about to be turned inside out. Melissa stood, her movements deliberate. She connected her laptop to the community center's projection system, a move that immediately set Karen on edge. This wasn't going to be a simple defensive presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Melissa began, her voice calm and clear. "I'd like to discuss not just my property, but the very foundation of our community's legal standing." The first document appeared. A land covenant from 1953, predating the Ridgemont Estate's development by nearly 2 decades. Tiny print, official stamps, legal language that would make most people's eyes glaze over. But not this crowd. Not tonight. Line by line, Melissa dismantled Karen's case. The fence, perfectly legal under the original land use agreement. The chickens, protected under 3 separate agricultural preservation statutes. The drone surveillance, a clear violation of privacy laws. Karen's confident posture began to crumble. Her red pen clicked nervously against her binder. Bill Rodriguez leaned forward, genuinely interested for the first time in years. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was a masterclass in legal jiu-jitsu. Melissa wasn't just defending her farm. She was exposing the fragile legal fiction that the HOA had been operating under for decades. Each slide was a surgical strike, precise, devastating, impossible to counter. The room grew quieter with each revelation. Neighbors who had whispered complaints about Melissa's unconventional property now listened with growing respect. This wasn't rebellion. This was strategic brilliance. The HOA's current bylaws, Melissa continued, are fundamentally incompatible with the original land use covenant, which means, Karen interrupted, "This is ridiculous. We're here to discuss fence heights and..." Which means, Melissa continued, her voice never raising, that every enforcement action taken by this board for the past 15 years may be legally challengeable. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone realizes the ground beneath their feet isn't as solid as they thought. Bill Rodriguez cleared his throat. Miss Hartwell, could you elaborate on that last point? Melissa smiled, the kind of smile that suggested this was only the beginning. Outside, the sun began to set over Ridgemont Estates. Her heritage chickens pecked quietly in their precisely maintained coop, a living testament to a way of life that couldn't be contained by suburban regulations. The war wasn't over, but tonight, the first decisive battle had been won. The aftermath of the HOA hearing spread through Ridgemont Estates like a digital wildfire. Screenshots of Melissa's presentation circulated on neighborhood group chats. Emails pinged between board members. The carefully constructed facade of suburban harmony had developed a very visible crack. Karen Thompson's phone remained suspiciously silent in the days following the meeting. Her usual morning routine, 3 emails before 7 a.m., drone surveillance reports, complaint drafting, had ground to a halt. Melissa knew this wasn't surrender. This was tactical regrouping. Her farm continued its rhythm, uninterrupted. Heritage chickens pecked at organic feed. Heirloom tomatoes ripened on the vine. The custom server at her barn continued collecting and analyzing data, a digital early warning system that would make most cybersecurity firms look amateur. Bill Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. He arrived unannounced on a Wednesday morning, his pickup truck kicking up dust as it rolled down Melissa's long gravel driveway. No HOA letterhead, no official summons, just Bill looking like a man carrying something more complicated than a simple message. Interesting hearing, he said by way of greeting, accepting the cup of coffee Melissa offered. The kitchen was a study in controlled chaos. Technical manuals mixed with agricultural journals. A half-disassembled drone component sat next to a cast iron skillet. Vintage computing equipment shared shelf space with C catalogs. Interesting is one word for it, Melissa replied, her smile suggesting she had several others in mind. Bill cut to the chase. Karen's planning something. I've been on the board long enough to recognize her strategy. This isn't over. Melissa had been expecting this conversation. Her entire career, first in cybersecurity, now in sustainable farming, had been about anticipating moves before they happened. I'm not looking for a war, she said. I'm looking for coexistence. But coexistence in HOA politics was rarely simple. The drone incident had been more than a privacy violation. It was a window into a deeper conflict, a battle between rigid suburban conformity and the kind of adaptive, intelligent resistance that couldn't be contained by bylaws and petty regulations. Biddle studied her, seeing beyond the surface. Melissa wasn't just a farmer. She was a strategist, someone who understood that true power came from information, preparation, and the ability to see multiple moves ahead. The board split, he admitted. Your presentation exposed some legal vulnerabilities nobody wanted to acknowledge. Some members are impressed. Others are terrified. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, nature's own surveillance system watching their conversation. What do you want? Melissa asked. Bill's response was unexpected. A compromise. Something that doesn't look like surrender to either side. The unspoken subtext hung in the air. Karen would never truly accept defeat, but a strategic retreat, that was possible. Melissa's phone buzzed, a notification from her custom monitoring system. Something was happening in the HOA's digital infrastructure. Not an attack, not yet, but movement. The chess match was about to enter its next phase. Outside, her heritage chickens continued their afternoon routine, utterly unaware of the complex human drama unfolding around their carefully maintained coop. Just another day on a farm that was anything but ordinary. 2 weeks after Bill's visit, the next move arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet precision of a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver. Karen Thompson's revised proposal landed in Melissa's mailbox on a crisp Thursday morning. No drone this time, no aggressive surveillance. Just 12 pages of meticulously crafted legal language that read like a diplomatic treaty more than a violation notice. The proposal was brilliant in its complexity, a compromise so nuanced it could have been written by a team of lawyers who understood that winning wasn't about total victory, but about creating a framework of controlled coexistence. Melissa spread the documents across her kitchen table, her heritage chickens pecking quietly outside the window. Each page was a careful dance of legal language, reducing fence height restrictions, creating specific agricultural exemptions, establishing a review process that looked more like collaboration than enforcement. Karen's fingerprints were everywhere, but so were Bill Rodriguez. The technical monitoring system in Melissa's barn had been tracking every digital communication, every draft, every subtle negotiation. What appeared to be a simple document was actually the result of weeks of behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Bill had done more than mediate. He'd orchestrated. Melissa understood something fundamental about power and that Karen never would. True control wasn't about rigid enforcement. It was about creating systems flexible enough to adapt, yet structured enough to maintain order. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bill. No words. Just a small emoji, a winking face that suggested more was happening beneath the surface than the document revealed. The proposal wasn't just about her farm. It was about reimagining what community could mean in a world of increasingly rigid suburban regulations. Each page told a story. Fence height reduced by 6 inches, a specific carve-out for heritage breed preservation, language that recognized the agricultural historical significance of properties like hers, subtle modifications that transformed a potential battleground into a negotiation. Karen's desperation was visible in the margins. Tiny notes, crossed-out sections. The document was a battlefield where legal language replaced drone surveillance. Melissa's cybersecurity background gave her an advantage most wouldn't recognize. Reading legal documents was just another form of code analysis. Every paragraph was a potential exploit, every clause a potential vulnerability. This wasn't surrender. This was evolution. Outside, her farm continued its rhythmic existence. Chickens moved with purposeful precision. Vegetable gardens thrived. The custom server in the barn continued its silent vigil, analyzing every digital communication, every subtle shift in the neighborhood's technological ecosystem. The HOA had tried to break her. Instead, they created something far more dangerous. Precedent. A template for how individual property owners could push back against bureaucratic overreach, not through rebellion, but through intelligent strategic negotiation. Bill Rodriguez understood this. Karen Thompson would eventually learn. As the afternoon light filtered through her kitchen window, Melissa allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The war wasn't over, but today she was winning, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful. Intelligent adaptation.